In this video, I want to explain how Lemonade gets $10 for spending merely $1.
I was never in this for the money. But it turns out that the money was an absolute necessity for me.
Yes, you heard that right. I believe Lemonade is getting somewhere in the ballpark of $10 of lifetime value return for spending $1 when you consider how much bundling they would have for their customers. Let's dive into it. This is a fun video. This is really interesting, and I'm going to have the equations all linked down below so you can easily pull these up yourselves at the end of this video and play with some of the numbers yourself. Let's go. If you remember from Lemonade's Investor Day, they gave some numbers around lifetime value to CAC. I also just did a video just recently released where I explored some of the LTV to CAC numbers, talked about that. So a little bit of another video if you want to check that out for a little more history of LTV to CAC and even what Legacy's LTV to CAC kind of range could potentially be. But Lemonade gave some figures for various products such as renters, LTV to CAC of 3.15, pet had an LTV to CAC of 3.8, and home, they gave an LTV to CAC of 1.6. Now, the question you might have, if I flip back through these, back to renters, for example, is say renters has an LTV to CAC of 3.15. Now, does that take into account the lifetime value that a customer might generate if they bundle all of their other products? Say they start as a renter and then after a few years of renting, they buy a home, and there's this natural massive bundling effect from where they start at a very low number up to a much higher number of premium and potential lifetime value. Does this 3.15 take into account some of that bundling? It's not totally clear. I don't think management's ever really gave us, ever really talked about this, but I don't think it does. I think it's more product specific, and I'll even kind of show you the numbers for that. It is, I believe it's more product specific within each product. So 3.8 for pet, that's sort of pet customers, but not considering, hey, pet customers might now go buy a car and rent it and also insure it with Lemonade. But back to what we care about for this video, how is Lemonade getting $10 for spending $1? If we think about what kind of lifetime value Lemonade might generate. Here, if you're not a math person, really this is not that complicated to understand. So just try and bear with me here and I'll explain it the best I can. If you think about it, so Lemonade is generating so much premium from a customer. Or really you have to think about it, a group of customers, a cohort of customers. Maybe it's 1,000 customers, 100,000, whatever the cohort or grouping you want to group them by. A certain amount of premium, and we're sort of averaging out that to a premium per customer in this calculation, but a certain amount of premium being generated. And then if you go multiply that by 1 minus the loss ratio, say it's 75%, you get 25% times the premium. That's how much premium's left over after you pay your losses. Then you can multiply that by annual dollar retention, and annual dollar retention is a figure Lemonade releases, and it takes into account how the premium of a cohort of customers or group of customers is changing over time, and also how the churn of those customers is changing over time. It factors both of those things into effect. Somebody actually, I haven't answered them yet, but a comment on my last video, they asked why isn't the premium number changing in the calculation? That's why, because in that video, I was just using annual dollar retention, just like this equation shows here right now. So annual dollar retention, and that's to the power of n, because, hey, we're going to sum up this equation over and over and over from now, year 0 to the year infinity. And if you plotted this on a graph, the value of each series that you're summing up is going to decay or drop down and eventually, fairly quickly approach 0 because you have a certain amount of annual dollar retention, a churn that's churning away the value of those customers, even though they might be increasing in value partly themselves. And then you divide all that by the time value of money, taking into those future cash flows putting them back to a present value, what they could be. So that's roughly what this equation looked like. I used this in my last video just briefly to pull up sort of what the LT lifetime value of Lemonade could be. And if we put in some example values for those different variables, and in the previous video I did talk about this same calculation briefly. Say $362 of IFP, which is the current premium per customer, say an 81% loss ratio, and an 85% annual dollar retention with, say, in this example, we're going to use 4% for the time value of money. If with those numbers, that setting, it roughly approximately equals your input premium or IFP that you're getting per customer is roughly equal to what the lifetime value of that customer would be. So it's kind of like, hey, and Lemonade currently can acquire a customer for around $100 per customer. So in this case, it's about a 3-to-1 ratio of the value you get from that customer if they were 81% loss ratio and 85% annual dollar retention. You get about a 3.6 LTV to CAC over the lifetime of that customer. In my mind, this is actually kind of conservative because sure, the annual dollar retention is roughly where they're at right now, but 81% loss ratio in general, especially over the lifetime of the customers, that should get better. In fact, from the Q3 letter, they talked about they're predicting a 60% lifetime loss ratio for those cohort of customers that joined in Q3 2022, or 61%. And they were showing how, hey, their first year predicted loss ratios for those cohorts were actually very accurate or even better than they were predicting. So they seem to be on track with those numbers. And again, the 81% in my mind seems quite conservative because they're showing more like 61% as sort of an overall average potentially. So instead, say we move the loss ratio down to 70% and we make that change. Instead of 81%, we go to 70%. I will click this to pull up those results. And suddenly the lifetime value, instead of $370, moves up to $594. And again, they're acquiring these customers for $100 per customer. So suddenly it's actually more like a 5 to 6x LTV to CAC that Lemonade is getting when you consider this annual dollar retention is considering some of the bundling effect that the customers would have. But then I was thinking about this further, and I think we can actually do better than just the annual dollar retention calculation. Because if you think about it, and you read the definition of annual dollar retention, it's a backward-looking metric over the last 12 months for the entire book of business. So it's a backward-looking metrics over the last 12 months for the entire book of business. It takes into account number of policies, changes in types of policies, and churn, as I mentioned, which all factors into the total premium per customer, and the churn rate is both factored into the annual dollar retention, but on a 12-month backward-looking basis. But if we could know the customer churn, which I've calculated in my Lemonade model, again, available to my Patreon members if you want to support the channel. If we could calculate the churn, which has steadily declined down to 18% for customers over the last 12 months, which I've calculated based on the annual dollar retention. And if we had some idea of, hey, this cohort of customers in the past, what kind of bundling effect are we getting for those customers? If we had a clear idea of that, I think I have a better idea of what the churn is and also what the bundling effect of a given cohort is, which then arrives us at this equation. And it's very similar, just slightly different. Again, we have how much premium per customer, but we're going to multiply that by, hey, how much is that cohort of customers growing their premium from bundling within that cohort? So how much is that bundling growth rate? And of course, you could set a growth rate and then an annual growth rate for that. And then each year of each series, you multiply it out. It adds to that. And then you could say, hey, 1 minus the loss ratio gets you your profits after losses. And then and then you could multiply that by 1 minus the churn rate, again to the power of n. For each series you churn more and more of that customer group away, and then again you count for the time value of money. But how do you get this bundling growth? I talked about this in my last video briefly. I'm going to talk about it again. Back in Q2 2022, we got this nice nugget that can give us a glimpse into what that bundling value for a cohort of customers could be, because this talked about, hey, we have car and home, and we're starting to see, excluding cars, so not even including car, but percentage of sales excluding car that are cross-sells or upsells. This is starting to grow from 17% all the way up to Q2 2022 was 21%. And then they talk about, hey, in Illinois, it's sort of one small sample. We have Lemonade Car available for a few quarters. We've seen 36% of all Lemonade sales in Q2 were cross-sells or upsells. So it jumps up to that 36% range, but otherwise it was 17 to 21% of new sales were cross-sells or upsells. So if we jump back over to my model, what I've overlaid on here from 2021 through to 2022, those same values, percentage of sales that were bundling, essentially 17 to 21%. And what you can do, if you take this line right here, you say, hey, we take how much premium overall was gained multiplied by that percentage of the premium that was gained that was due to bundling, and then divide that by the number of customers. You get a premium per customer increase from cross sells or from bundling. So now $6, $4, $5, about $5 or $6 per quarter is coming in premium per customer increases coming from bundling. And then if you take that as a percentage of the previous quarter's premium per customer, you get a percentage increase of 2.5%, 1.6, 1.9 kind of percent average. You're growing your premium per customer quarter over quarter. So pretty significant growth just from bundling inside of there. And of course, this is without car. So if you had a car in a state and the car was priced correctly and they wanted to grow the car, you say you put in 36% like they were suggesting. In that example, you're suddenly going from 1.9% to over 3% just for that quarter over quarter increase in premium per customer. And this kind of gives us a good example of, hey, what kind of premium per customer growth can we expect and can we put in our equation? So if we jump back to this equation and I say, I'm going to put in a sort of a medium, somewhat bullish, somewhat conservative result, say $362 of premium per customer, 8% bundling year over year, because if you looked at those numbers, they're about 1.9% quarter over quarter or more, maybe even up to 3% quarter over quarter. So annually, I'm going to say roughly 8%, and then a 70% loss ratio. As some people have been questioning, hey, if it's below 75%, don't they give it all to charity? No, that's not true. By the way, that's not true. That would be another video. I should try and break that down further, but that's not true. 18% churn rate, which is currently what I'm at for my model. And again, I'm just sticking all throughout with a time value of 4%. So if we put in those inputs, let's click through and we'll bring up that result. So 8% quarter, again, 362, 8% bundling effect, 70% loss ratio, 18% churn. You get up to a 731 lifetime value. The present value of those customers per customer on that cohort is 731, but they're acquiring customers for approximately $100 per customer. So you're getting, like, with these numbers, you're getting about a 7-to-1 LTV to CAC ratio. 7-to-1 LTV to CAC ratio. Absolutely phenomenal ratio for these customers. Of course, this takes time. It's not going to be super obvious day one because this bundling happens, 8% each year, I'm saying. So it takes, 8% you're added to your premium, 8% you're added to your premium, 8% over and over and over again. And then other factors like your churn rate slowly eats away at the customer base until it eventually, asymptotes to zero. But now let's look at a few other scenarios and kind of get a sense of the range of where this LTV to CAC could come in at. So this is what I'm calling the medium result. It was up here. But now if I adjust the bundling down to 6%, and the loss rate, a more conservative, I'm going to call it. So less bundling overall, 6% per year. Loss ratio is a little bit higher. Average over the lifetime is 75%. Churn is 18%, similar to what we have right there. If we bring up that equation, see where we end up. Well, then we get $551 of present lifetime value for that customer with those inputs. So still pretty solid result. Not as good as we just had, but still a 5.5, roughly 5.5 LTV to CAC ratio if they can acquire the customers. And now if we look at the next version, I'm going to call it the more bullish version. So getting more bullish side, again, same premium per customer you're starting with, but I'm going to say they actually have a 10% bundling effect instead of 6% or 8% like we had in the last two. Loss ratio of 61%. And you might think, wow, that's 61%. That's way too low. Sounds low until you look again at that graph from the Q3 letter that said, hey, the predicted lifetime loss ratio of these guys in Q3 2022 is going to be 61%. So say we use that number, 61% and 18% churn, and again with the 10% bundling. So let's see what that brings up. And now you're getting over $1,000, or like the title of the video, potentially somewhere in that 10 to 1 ratio, 10x of your initial CAC spend for the lifetime value of the customer. Again, if you start with the current premiums and you're getting 10% premium per customer growth, 61% loss ratio, 18% of those customers churn away each year. Over $1,000, absolutely amazing. Of course, for fun, we got to put in the max, what I'm calling max bullish, where the only change I'm making is you're increasing the bundling to 12%. Bundling, otherwise 61% loss ratio, churn 18%. So if we put that one in max bullish, you get even more bundling effect. As maybe you're in a state where you have car and car wasn't available before, and you have this pool of customers that's constantly growing. And then you have a 12 to 1 ratio, or $1,200 of present lifetime value for those customers. Absolutely incredible. But now you might think, well, that's kind of interesting, but maybe from year 1 to 5, this one's a little bit different. Let's say they start with this much premium and they have a higher bundling rate because they're lower premium customers in general, so it's 10%. But they have a higher loss ratio, maybe it's 85% average over the first 5 years. Churn, you say maybe that's 18%, like we're calculating now. But then you say, hey, maybe year 6 to 10, it changes a bit. Now you have a starting premium per customer that's higher because 362 with the 5 years of 10% gets you to 530. And then you say, well, maybe now the bundling's less and less significant, so it's 6%, but the loss ratio is higher, so we're going to say that's 70%, maybe because they're just a group of customers that has less changes in their life and is less likely to have a claim, so then their churn also drops down to 15% and they have a safer loss ratio. And then say years 11 to infinity, you have a higher premium per customer you're starting with, again, 530 with the 6% bundling, and then say the bundling grows 4% per year for that group until they decay away, of course, to zero. The churn is a bigger factor, 15% there. But these are much, again, safer customers. Again, they've weeded out the worst customers. They've filed claims, they've canceled, they've ditched those customers, and you have 60% loss ratio. So if we put that in, it's a little more complicated, but you actually have all three of those equations written out for the amounts of time that are applicable. You still get a result, even if that you're trying to make get a little more fine-tuned on where things might be. You're still getting $700 of current value, lifetime value that those customers bring. So still somewhere in the order of a 7 to 1 ratio, which is really, really phenomenal. But these equations are pretty fun to play with and think about yourself. So I will have these equation links down in the description. You should be able to click them and it should pop up right here. So it's really easy for you to say, hey, what if they get, that 12% growth rate? And what if churn drops down to 15%? And what if the loss ratio is 75%, then what's the result going to be? And it's you get pretty quickly, in that case, it's it's a 10 to 1 ratio again, 10x for that. But you can adjust these numbers really easily, play with them yourselves to get a sense of the range. In my mind, they're getting something like 5x to 10x LTV to CAC when you consider how much bundling is happening for each customer. And again, as I said earlier, these numbers aren't really these growth values that we're going to see, I think, take time to really manifest. Now, we're accounting somewhat for time, but they still take time to manifest in the financials because you're still only getting the customer maybe $60 a year, $100 a year of premium for a renter, and then they might have a massive amount of growth as they age over time and get more and more products. But have fun with this. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. Really appreciate you guys and appreciate the Lemonade community that's growing online. So many more people seem to be interested in it. So it's really awesome to see. Thanks again for watching. Remember, it's in the bag.